to 8 64 gig DIMMs, you're definitely going to start seeing that there are some pricing differences. Of course, the big one is going from one 128 gig per channel, or DIMM per channel, where you would have 8 of them in the system for 1 terabyte, and going to 16 64 gig DIMMs. That is a huge price delta, or a very large price delta in comparison to the system, and so it's a good example of where that's useful. Now up here, you're going to see that there's actually a whole bunch of depopulated components, which is part of the -LE portion of the model name. What that basically is Tyin is removing all of the connectors, and they're actually relatively pricey connectors for the high density PCIe Gen 4 lanes that would come out of here. And so instead of actually populating those, Tyin is saving the cost, which brings down the cost of the overall system. I know there are folks that may say, well, that's kind of a bummer. We don't get the advantage of having those extra lanes. But in a system like this, there's really only so much expansion that you get. So it's just kind of cost savings by them not putting it there. And since you can't really use it anyway, I guess it makes sense. Now, behind the CPU and the memory, what you actually have is all the expansion. And what you have is you have 2 M.2 NVMe drive slots. I think they're PCIe Gen 3 slots. Now, out of those motherboard PCIe slots, what we get is we get a riser, and that PCIe riser has 2 slots, because there are 2 different sections. You get 2 PCIe Gen 4 by 16 slots, and so you can do things like put 2, say, 200 gigabit Mellanox ConnectX-6DX NICs into each of those. So you can have 2 200 gig NICs for a total of 400 gigs of Ethernet bandwidth coming out of the server if you just really want to go do something like that. That's something that you couldn't do in the PCIe Gen 3 generation because, well, you by 16 slot can't power a 200 gig Ethernet slot by itself, so that's a good reason. One thing to note is that these are only half length. They're not full length card slots, so you can't do things like if you wanted to go put like a NVIDIA A100 full length card, you just couldn't do it in something like this, but you could put something, say like an NVIDIA T4 or something that's kind of a smaller, lower power card in a slot like this. In terms of networking though, it's not just these card slots. You can actually just use, there's an OCP NIC 2.0, so not the newer 3.0 standard, but you have a 2.0 standard NIC that you can go put in here. And so it's not, the nice thing is it's just not a custom mezzanine or anything like that. There's tons of OCP NIC 2.0 cards out there, so it should be pretty easy to go find something for this. For networking, there are 2 1 gig Ethernet ports, and one interesting thing here is that these are not Intel-based ports, they're actually Broadcom BCM 5720 NICs that are on the back of the system. So you don't necessarily get 10 gig Ethernet, you get 1 gig Ethernet, but frankly, I think that if you have a EPYC system these days, you're most likely going to be deploying at minimum 10 gig Ethernet, which you can put in the OCP NIC 2.0 slot, or if you're going to go to faster Ethernet, you have plenty of options to do that as well. Some of the other little tiny features that I figure we should talk about are that we actually have a USB 3 header. So there's an internal type A header if you want to go put a license key or, I don't know, something on a USB thing there, you can do that. There's an SD card slot. And then there is one other little feature that we should talk about, which is that there's a Marvell SATA controller. And that Marvell 9235 provides the SATA functionality. This is a little feature of this motherboard that's just a little different. And rounding out the rear features, we have our 2 1 gig Ethernet NICs, we have VGA, we have serial, we have USB, and then we have an out-of-band management port. This does use an ASPEED AST 2500, and Tyin uses a pretty industry standard Megrac SPX solution for their management interface, and this is a standard BMC, which is an AST 2500, and so overall it's just kind of an industry standard solution to do management. If you want things like an IKVM functionality or HTML5 IKVM functionality, this has you covered. Overall, in terms of hardware, personally, I think this is a really interesting platform. And let me tell you a little bit about why, and why it actually makes a lot of sense to me, and it's something that I feel like we just don't cover